The greatest library in the ancient world probably wasn't destroyed by a fire. It didn't vanish in one night. It died slowly, and that may be far more terrifying. For centuries we've been told that Julius Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria and destroyed humanity's ancient knowledge. But the historical evidence doesn't tell that story. The library survived Caesar. It survived wars. It survived political revolutions, and possibly survived for centuries after the famous fire. So how did it disappear? And what knowledge disappeared with it? The answer isn't one catastrophic event. It's a story about how an entire civilization gradually stopped preserving its own knowledge. Around 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt. He had already conquered enormous territories across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. And in Egypt, he founded a city that would eventually become one of the most important intellectual centers in the ancient world, Alexandria. Alexander would never see what the city became. He died only a few years later in Babylon. His empire fractured almost immediately. His generals fought over the territories he had conquered, and Egypt eventually fell under the control of one of them, Ptolemy. Ptolemy established a dynasty that would rule Egypt for almost 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic rulers understood that Alexandria had something other cities didn't: location. The city sat directly on the Mediterranean. Ships arrived from Greece, Anatolia, Cyprus, Syria, North Africa, and beyond. But the rulers of Alexandria wanted another kind of cargo: knowledge. They wanted books, they wanted scholars, and they wanted Alexandria to become the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. The Ptolemies began attracting some of the greatest scholars of the Greek-speaking world. They created an institution known as the Mouseion. The name means something like place of the muses, but it wasn't simply a museum in the modern sense. It was closer to a research institution. Scholars lived there, they studied there, they debated there, and they needed books. Lots of them. Ancient sources give wildly different numbers for how many scrolls were eventually held in Alexandria. Some accounts describe hundreds of thousands, but we should be careful with those numbers. A scroll was not necessarily one book. A single work could occupy multiple scrolls. But there is little doubt that Alexandria possessed one of the largest collections of written material in the ancient Mediterranean. There are ancient stories claiming that ships entering Alexandria were searched for books. If manuscripts were discovered, copies were made. Whether every detail of those stories is accurate is difficult to prove. But the broader point is clear. The Ptolemies were aggressively collecting written knowledge. And this wasn't simply about possessing books. Alexandrian scholars were doing something revolutionary. They were comparing manuscripts. Ancient texts were copied by hand, and handwritten copies change. A scribe can accidentally skip a line, repeat a sentence, change a word, add something from memory. Over generations, different versions of the same work could develop. Alexandrian scholars compared different copies and tried to determine what earlier authors had actually written. One of their greatest subjects was Homer. The poems attributed to Homer had been transmitted for generations. Scholars studied different versions and attempted to establish reliable texts. And the intellectual environment produced extraordinary discoveries. Euclid became associated with Alexandria and produced the Elements, one of the most influential mathematical works ever written. The astronomer Aristarchus of Samos proposed an astonishing idea. The Earth moved around the Sun, more than 1,000 years before Copernicus became famous for a similar model. Then there was Eratosthenes. He wanted to calculate the circumference of the Earth. He didn't have satellites. He didn't have GPS. He used geometry and measurements of shadows. His result was remarkably close to the actual size of the planet. Alexandria had become something extraordinary. Ideas from different cultures could meet in one place. Egyptian traditions, Greek mathematics, Babylonian astronomy, Persian knowledge, medical traditions. The city became a giant intellectual network. But there was a weakness built into the entire system. It depended on political power. The library needed funding. The scholars needed patronage. The manuscripts needed copying. And rulers eventually change. The early Ptolemies were aggressive supporters of scholarship, but later rulers faced political instability, power struggles, rebellions, foreign wars. The dynasty became increasingly focused on survival, and the intellectual environment began to suffer. Some scholars were expelled, others left. This is one of the most important things to understand about the Library of Alexandria. A library isn't really a building, it is a system. You need people to read the books, people to copy them, people to teach them, people to preserve them, and people willing to pay for all of it. Take those things away, and a library can begin dying, even while its walls are still standing. By the 1st century BCE, Roman power dominated much of the Mediterranean. Egypt remained independent for a time, but the Ptolemaic kingdom was becoming increasingly dependent on Rome, and eventually, the final great ruler of the dynasty entered the story, Cleopatra VII. She is usually remembered because of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but she was also the final ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Alexandria remained wealthy, politically important, and the center of learning. Then, in 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived. Egypt was in the middle of a civil war. Caesar became involved in the conflict. His forces were vulnerable in Alexandria, and Caesar ordered Egyptian ships to be burned. The fire spread. This event became attached to the most famous version of the library story. According to the popular legend, Caesar's fire destroyed the Library of Alexandria. Thousands upon thousands of books supposedly disappeared. But there is a serious problem. The evidence suggests the library did not simply disappear in 48 BCE. References to the library and its scholars continue afterward. Collections of books continued to exist in Alexandria. So Caesar's fire was real. Books were almost certainly destroyed. But the idea that Caesar burned the entire Great Library in one dramatic event doesn't fit the historical evidence. Something was lost, but the institution survived because Alexandria had more than one collection of books. There were different buildings, different collections, and different institutions associated with scholarship. The famous royal library was connected with the Mouseion. Another collection was associated with the Serapeum. So when people say the Library of Alexandria, they may be imagining one enormous building containing every manuscript. Reality was more complicated. Alexandria was a city full of intellectual institutions, and those institutions changed over time. The Roman period brought more instability, wars, revolts, civil conflicts. In the 3rd century CE, Alexandria suffered major devastation during Roman conflicts. Parts of the city were destroyed. The institutions connected with the ancient intellectual center suffered as well. But again, there was no single moment when someone announced that the library was gone. The decline was gradual. And then the religious landscape of Alexandria changed dramatically. Christianity became increasingly powerful throughout the Roman Empire. But tensions between Christians and followers of traditional religions became increasingly severe. In 391 CE, the Serapeum was destroyed. The Serapeum had been one of Alexandria's major pagan religious complexes. It was also associated with a library collection. This event is sometimes described as the destruction of the Great Library. But that description is misleading. The original royal library had already been declining for centuries. What existed at the Serapeum was a later collection. Books may have been destroyed there, but this was not necessarily the final destruction of the famous royal library. Then comes another famous name, Hypatia. Hypatia was a mathematician and philosopher living in Alexandria during the early 5th century. She became one of the most respected intellectual figures of her time. In 415 CE, she was brutally murdered by a Christian mob. Her death became a powerful symbol of the conflict between ancient philosophy and the increasingly Christian Roman world. But there is an important distinction. Hypatia's murder was real. The religious and political conflict was real. But there is no reliable evidence that she was murdered because she was protecting the Great Library. By the time Hypatia lived, the famous Ptolemaic library had already been declining for centuries. And then we reach one of the most famous legends, the Arab conquest of Alexandria. In the 7th century CE, Arab armies conquered Egypt. Centuries later, a story appeared claiming that the conquerors discovered the library. According to the legend, the Caliph ordered the books destroyed. If the books agreed with the Quran, they were supposedly unnecessary. If they disagreed, they were supposedly dangerous. It is a powerful story, but there is a major problem. The story appears centuries after the conquest. It does not appear in reliable contemporary accounts. And there is no convincing evidence that the enormous ancient library still existed in anything like its legendary form by the time of the Arab conquest. The famous story of Arab conquerors burning the Library of Alexandria is therefore almost certainly a later legend. So now we have a strange situation. Caesar didn't destroy everything. The destruction of the Serapeum wasn't the destruction of the original library. Hypatia wasn't the final librarian defending the books. And the Arab conquest didn't produce one enormous book-burning event. So what happened? The answer may be much simpler and much more disturbing. The library probably died slowly. Think about what happens to a collection of handwritten manuscripts. Ancient scrolls were made from materials that could decay. They needed to be copied. If a manuscript became damaged and nobody copied it, the text could disappear. Now imagine that happening across an enormous collection. One manuscript disappears, another is damaged, a third is copied incorrectly, a fourth is never copied. Then funding decreases, fewer scholars arrive, buildings are damaged, collections become dispersed, and suddenly, after several generations, the library is no longer what it once was. No dramatic fire is required. No invading army is required. The knowledge simply stops being transmitted. We imagine that the ancient world produced books, stored them in Alexandria, and then one day someone burned the library. But knowledge doesn't work like that. A book survives only if someone copies it. A scientific idea survives only if someone teaches it. A language survives only if people continue speaking it. Remove the chain and the knowledge can disappear. Thousands of ancient works have been lost. Ancient writers mention books that no longer exist. Historians refer to earlier historians whose works disappeared. Playwrights produced hundreds of works. Only a fraction survive. We know some of the greatest surviving ancient literature, but we don't know what was in the works that vanished. And that is where Alexandria becomes genuinely haunting, because we cannot make a complete list of what was lost. If we knew exactly what disappeared, we could at least name it. But countless works left no trace. A historian could have written an entire account of a civilization. If nobody preserved it, we would never know. A mathematician could have discovered an idea centuries ahead of his time. If the manuscript disappeared, the discovery disappeared with it. A doctor could have recorded medical treatments. A philosopher could have written an argument that might have changed intellectual history. We have no way to recover books that left no surviving references. They are not lost mysteries, they are invisible losses. And perhaps that is the real tragedy of Alexandria. Not that we know a great library was destroyed, but that we don't know exactly what disappeared. People sometimes say that the destruction of Alexandria set civilization back thousands of years. We cannot establish that. Civilization does not develop along one straight road. Knowledge existed in many places. Books moved between cultures. Scholars traveled. Ideas were translated. Some Greek works survived in the Byzantine world. Many ancient texts were translated into Arabic. Scholars across the Islamic world preserved, studied, and expanded earlier Greek, Persian, Indian, and other intellectual traditions. Later, some of those works reached medieval Europe. Alexandria burned, but humanity did not forget everything. Instead, knowledge moved. Some survived, some changed, some disappeared, and some were rediscovered centuries later. Babylonian astronomers recorded celestial movements. Greek scholars developed mathematical models. Alexandrian scientists built on earlier knowledge. Islamic astronomers later preserved and improved many of those traditions. European scholars eventually encountered them. The chain of knowledge was damaged at times, but it wasn't completely broken. It wasn't the only place where knowledge existed. It was a symbol of the ancient world's ambition to collect knowledge in one place. And for generations, they succeeded. But centralization creates vulnerability. When everything is concentrated in one institution, the institution becomes extremely important. but it also becomes dependent on the system around it. If the government collapses, funding disappears. If scholars leave, expertise disappears. If trade collapses, manuscripts stop arriving. The library was never isolated from history. It was part of history, and history eventually overwhelmed it. This is why the slow decline theory is so compelling. There probably wasn't one day when Alexandria stopped being Alexandria. There were stages: a weaker institution, fewer scholars, smaller collections, political instability, physical destruction, changing religious priorities. Eventually, the old institution faded into memory, and that process may have taken centuries. The legend gives us a villain, the evidence gives us a process, and processes are often harder to understand than villains, because there is no single person to blame. Instead, people simply make other choices, spend money somewhere else, stop copying an unpopular book, build a new institution, fight a war, change a government. Each decision might seem small. Together, over generations, they can erase an intellectual civilization. That is why the story of Alexandria still matters today, because we have far more information than the ancient world ever did. But we also depend on systems to preserve it. Modern humanity has enormous digital libraries, millions of books, scientific papers, databases, archives. But digital information isn't automatically permanent. Servers fail, websites disappear, file formats become obsolete, and if nobody maintains the system, information can disappear. The technology is different. The principle is the same. Knowledge survives because someone chooses to preserve it. The ancient scholars of Alexandria understood this. They copied manuscripts. They compared different versions. They edited texts. They knew that information could disappear. That is why they collected it. And perhaps the most haunting question isn't who burned the Library of Alexandria. Maybe the better question is, what knowledge disappeared because nobody copied it? Think about all the ancient authors whose names survived while their books did not. All the scientific works referenced by other writers, all the maps that no longer exist, all the histories, all the poems. We can only see the surviving fragments. The missing pieces are silent, and silence is difficult to measure. We can count the books that survived. We cannot count the books nobody remembered. That may be why the Library of Alexandria has become one of history's greatest mysteries. Today, Alexandria is still a living city. The ancient city lies beneath and around the modern one. Archaeologists continue to uncover pieces of its past. And in 2002, the Biblioteca Alexandrina opened as a modern tribute to the ancient library. It is not the original library. It does not contain the lost scrolls, but it represents the same idea. Collect knowledge, preserve it, share it, pass it forward. Because the lesson of Alexandria isn't that knowledge is destined to disappear. It is that knowledge requires people. People to protect it. People to copy it. People to teach it. And people to care enough to pass it to the next generation. Not with one final explosion, but piece by piece. generation by generation, until the institution became a memory. And perhaps that is more frightening than the legend, because a fire can be blamed, a slow disappearance cannot. There is no single moment to point toward, no single person responsible, just thousands of small losses accumulating over centuries. A manuscript not copied, a scholar who leaves, a tradition that isn't passed on, and eventually, something that once existed becomes something nobody remembers. The Library of Alexandria is therefore not only a story about the ancient world, it is a warning. Civilization remembers what it preserves. Everything else is vulnerable to time, because the greatest mystery may never be solved. We may never know exactly how many books Alexandria contained, and we will never know everything that was lost. But perhaps that uncertainty is the point. History is not the complete record of the human past. It is the surviving record. The books we have are the survivors. The books we lost have no voice. They cannot tell us which ideas might have changed history. And perhaps somewhere inside that silence is the greatest lost library of all. Not the building, not the scrolls, but the knowledge we don't even know we lost. If stories like this keep you curious, stay close. There is more buried in history waiting to be found.